Amira adjusted the folds of her light blue hijab as she sat at her desk, trying to steady her racing heart. Today felt heavier than any other day at school, heavier than the usual tests and presentations, heavier than the routine whispers in the hallways. She had always loved school. Math made her feel sharp. History made her feel connected to the world. English gave her a voice, but today she knew would test more than her academic skills. Ms. Parker entered the room with her usual sharp steps, her heels clicking against the floor. She carried herself with confidence, her crisp white shirt tucked neatly into her pants, and her hair perfectly styled. She was the kind of teacher students either admired or feared, and today Amira felt a little of both. "Good morning, class," Miss Parker said, scanning the room. Her eyes landed on Amira and held her gaze. "Amira, a word, please." A hush fell over the classroom. Students shifted in their seats, whispering, curious about what was about to happen. Amira's stomach tightened as she rose from her seat and walked toward the front of the room. Every step seemed heavier than the last, every breath louder in her ears. "Yes, Miss Parker," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. Ms. Parker's frown deepened. "I think you should remove that scarf while in class. It's distracting, and it doesn't fit with the school environment." The words hit Amira like a sudden winter chill. She froze, unsure of how to respond immediately. Her classmates watched silently, some shifting uncomfortably, others staring in curiosity. Amira took a deep breath. She had prepared for moments like this. Her faith was important, and her hijab was not just cloth. It was identity, dignity, and belief. "Ms. Parker," Amira said, her voice calm but unwavering, "I'm allowed to wear my hijab. It's part of who I am. Please respect that." The teacher's frown deepened. "I understand your personal beliefs," she said slowly, "but school policy—" Amira interrupted gently. "I know the policy. It doesn't mention banning religious attire. I'm asking you to respect that." Whispers spread across the room. Some students nodded subtly, others clenched their fists in silent support. One student, Daniel, muttered, "Go, Amira," barely audible. Ms. Parker's face hardened. She had been teaching for 15 years and had never been challenged like this. She was used to compliance. Yet here was a quiet 16-year-old standing her ground without anger. The rest of the day passed in an odd blur. Amira tried to focus on algebra and history notes, but her mind kept drifting back to the confrontation. Every glance at Ms. Parker felt heavy. Every whisper in the hallway seemed amplified. By the end of the day, the incident had already spread. Some students took videos on their phones. Others posted about it on social media. Amira walked home slowly, the late afternoon sun warming her shoulders. Her mother, Fatima, was waiting at the front door, holding a plate of freshly baked cookies. "How was school?" Fatima asked, noticing her daughter's thoughtful expression. Amira hesitated. "There was a situation." She explained what had happened in careful words, staying calm despite the nerves. Fatima listened, her eyes soft but alert. "I'm proud of you, Amira. You handled that with dignity. Never let anyone take that from you." The next morning, Miss Parker faced the principal's office. Principal Rogers had called her in to understand what had happened. "You handled it in a way that might have seemed strict," Principal Rogers began, "but this is about more than rules." Amira stood her ground calmly without anger. "That's rare." Miss Parker leaned back in her chair. I didn't expect her to speak up like that. I thought she'd comply." "Perhaps," the principal said gently, "you underestimated how much faith and identity mean to students. Sometimes the strongest lessons happen outside textbooks." Back in class, Amira noticed the change in atmosphere. Ms. Parker wasn't as cold as before. She wasn't smiling either, but there was a pause in her criticism, a softness that had never been there. Days went by, and the social media posts spread far and wide. People from across the country commented. Many praised Amira for her courage. Comments ranged from, "This girl is brave beyond words," "Teachers should learn from her calm dignity." Some posts criticized the school for not being stricter, debating policy versus personal rights. But Amira ignored them. She knew she had done what was right. Meanwhile, Ms. Parker could not ignore the online response. She read articles, watched videos, and saw how students, parents, and educators were discussing the incident. Curiosity sparked in her mind. She realized that she had only seen Amira's hijab as an obstacle, something to control in a classroom. But the reactions online showed her a different perspective, one of faith, courage, and identity. That evening, Ms. Parker sat alone at her kitchen table. The house was quiet. She brewed tea and opened a notebook she hadn't touched in months. She began jotting down thoughts, questions, reflections. Why was faith so important to her students? What did the hijab mean? Could understanding her students' perspective make her a better teacher? She found herself searching online for answers. She read about Islam, its principles and respect for dignity, kindness, and community. Slowly, the rigidity she had felt toward Amira softened. Over the next weeks, she asked questions discreetly to colleagues. She wanted to understand, not judge. She learned that hijab was a personal expression of devotion, not a statement against anyone. One afternoon, during lunch, she approached Amira quietly. "I want to apologize," she said. "I shouldn't have asked you to remove your hijab. I realize now that I was wrong." Amira's eyes widened slightly, then softened. "Thank you, Ms. Parker. I appreciate that. I'm glad we can understand each other." The classroom felt lighter after that. Other students noticed the shift. Ms. Parker was more patient, more curious, less rigid. She asked more questions, listened more. Over time, she began reading the Quran, seeking understanding of the faith she had once dismissed. She read about compassion, reflection, and humility. She realized that religion, when understood, could be a source of guidance and comfort, not conflict. One evening, she sat by the window, watching the stars. "Amira was right," she whispered. "This isn't about rules or authority. It's about dignity, faith, and truth." She thought about the lessons she had learned, not from a textbook, but from a brave 16-year-old who had refused to be silenced. And in that moment, she felt the first stirrings of a journey that would eventually lead her to Islam. The classroom had been the battlefield, but the real transformation happened quietly, within a heart willing to learn. By the end of the semester, Ms. Parker no longer saw hijabs as obstacles. She saw stories, courage, and identity. She began volunteering to learn more, speaking to the local mosque, and attending community events. Amira, unaware of the depth of change she had inspired, continued her studies, her faith, and her life. But she noticed Ms. Parker's curiosity, the gentle questions, and the newfound respect in her eyes. It was the beginning of a story that would touch not just two people, but an entire school, an online community, and eventually a teacher who had learned to embrace faith, compassion, and understanding. Before we begin, drop your country and time in the comments. Ms. Parker had spent the last few months in a state of quiet reflection. After the incident with Amira, she could no longer see her classroom as just a place to enforce rules. She began to notice the small gestures of her students, the way they spoke about family, faith, and community. Each story they shared, each question they asked, left a mark on her heart. One afternoon, after school had ended and the classrooms were empty, she stayed behind, sitting alone at her desk. The sunlight streamed through the windows, and the quiet hum of the air conditioning filled the room. She opened her notebook and began writing down the questions that had been on her mind since that day. What does it mean to have faith? How does belief shape a person's actions? How can I understand a world I had never taken the time to explore? These questions led her online, where she found articles, blogs, and videos about Islam. At first, it was just curiosity, but soon she was reading with a deeper intention. She read about the Quran, about compassion, honesty, and patience. She read stories of Muslims from all over the world who had transformed their lives through faith. The more she read, the more she realized that Islam was not a rigid set of rules, but a guide for living a meaningful life. One evening, she decided to visit a local mosque. She had never set foot in one before and felt nervous, unsure of how she would be received. When she arrived, she was greeted warmly by the imam and several community members. "Welcome," the imam said, smiling gently. "Everyone is welcome here. Please feel free to ask questions." Ms. Parker hesitated, then said softly, "I want to learn. I want to understand." The imam nodded. Faith is a journey. There are no wrong questions, only sincere ones. She began attending weekly sessions at the mosque, reading the Quran, and speaking with knowledgeable members of the community. She asked about prayer, the meaning of hijab, fasting, in the principles of Islam. Each session left her with more questions and more reflection. Slowly, she began to see her old assumptions crumble. The teacher who had once demanded that Amira remove her hijab now felt humility and curiosity. Her heart was opening to a perspective she had dismissed for years. Meanwhile, at school, students noticed subtle changes in Ms. Parker. She no longer focused on compliance and rules alone. She listened more carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and engaged students in discussions about culture and religion with respect. She encouraged dialogue about differences and similarities in belief systems, emphasizing empathy and understanding. Amira noticed these changes and felt a quiet pride. She understood that courage was contagious, and the courage to stand for faith had sparked growth in someone else. One day, Ms. Parker asked Amira to join her for lunch. Sitting in the quiet cafeteria, she leaned forward and spoke with a soft tone. "Amira, can I ask you something personal?" Amira nodded. "Of course." "I've been learning about Islam," Ms. Parker admitted, "and I feel drawn toward it. I want to understand it fully, not just read about it. Would you help me?" Amira smiled warmly. "I would be honored, Ms. Parker, but the most important thing is your heart and sincerity. Faith cannot be rushed. It must be embraced genuinely." From that moment, their conversations deepened. Amira answered questions about prayer, fasting, and the values behind her faith. She explained the significance of hijab, not as a burden, but as a symbol of dignity, identity, and devotion. Ms. Parker listened intently, absorbing each explanation, reflecting on her own life, and comparing her experiences to the lessons Amira shared. At home, Ms. Parker spent evenings in reflection. She prayed privately, asking for guidance and understanding. She journaled her thoughts, documenting each discovery, each question answered, and each doubt resolved. Slowly, she felt a sense of peace that she had never experienced before. It was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual awakening. Every lesson she learned, every reflection she made, was a step closer to understanding the faith that had once seemed foreign to her. She began attending mosque events, meeting families, and observing prayer. She marveled at the sense of community and humility, how people of all backgrounds came together in faith and respect. The principles she had read about, compassion, honesty, patience, became real, tangible in everyday interactions. Ms. Parker realized that she had misunderstood Islam all her life. It was not a set of restrictions, but a guide toward a meaningful, balanced, and ethical life. Meanwhile, word of her personal journey spread quietly. Students began asking questions, curious about why Ms. Parker had changed so much. Some parents reached out, wanting to understand what had inspired her. Ms. Parker never imposed her beliefs. She only shared her experience honestly and humbly. She emphasized respect, understanding, and the value of learning from others. Amira's classmates noticed her growth as well. They were inspired by how a teacher could admit her mistakes, reflect, and embrace understanding. The incident with the hijab became more than a classroom story. It became an example of courage, dialogue, and personal growth. Finally, after months of reflection, study, and heartfelt learning, Ms. Parker made the decision to formally embrace Islam. The Imam led her through the declaration of faith, and she felt a profound sense of peace and clarity. The teacher who once demanded the hijab be removed had now accepted the guidance, wisdom, and compassion of the faith she had once misunderstood. The day she shared her conversion with the school, she stood before her students with humility and calm confidence. "I once made a mistake," she said softly, looking at Amira. "I judged too quickly, without understanding. Today, I have learned to see through the eyes of faith, compassion, and respect. And I am grateful to the student who taught me this lesson." The students applauded quietly, a mix of surprise and admiration filling the room. Some whispered to each other, "She really changed." The story soon spread online, inspiring conversations far beyond the school walls. People commented about courage, understanding, and the power of education to transform not just minds but hearts. Ms. Parker continued teaching, now fully embracing dialogue, curiosity, and empathy. She encouraged students to ask questions, to respect differences, and to seek knowledge. Her classroom became a place of learning, growth, and mutual respect, rather than fear and compliance. Amira continued her life with quiet pride, realizing that her stand for faith had not only defended her dignity, but had inspired someone else to find truth, understanding, and peace. She saw the ripple effect of courage and learned that even small actions could have a monumental impact. The story of the student and teacher became an example of how dialogue, empathy, and faith can transform lives. From that day on, the school was a place where students could celebrate identity, respect belief, and embrace learning from one another. And in the hearts of both teacher and student, a lesson was etched forever. Courage can ignite change, understanding can bridge divides, and faith can illuminate the path to compassion, humility, and truth.